8 million people, over 7,000 skyscrapers, a city where you can hear 100 languages on a single subway ride. New York City today stands as one of the most powerful urban centers humanity has ever created. But 15,000 years ago, this same ground sat buried under a sheet of ice nearly a mile thick. The transformation from frozen wasteland to global metropolis didn't happen overnight. It took millennia of geological shifts, centuries of human ambition, and countless lives spent building, dreaming, fighting, and rebuilding. The story of New York City isn't just American history. It's a mirror reflecting humanity's restless drive to create something extraordinary from whatever ground we stand on. Today, we're unveiling the entire history of New York City, from the first footprints to the towers of glass and steel that pierce the clouds. Every era, every wave of change, every triumph and disaster shaped what stands here now. This is how New York became New York. Chapter 1. The Ancient Ground. Long before anyone called this place Manhattan, long before the first human voice echoed across these hills, the land itself was being carved into shape. Around 13,000 years ago, the last great ice age began releasing its grip on North America. Massive glaciers that had covered everything slowly retreated northward, grinding the bedrock beneath them, sculpting valleys, leaving behind the contours that would one day define New York Harbor. The ice didn't just disappear quietly. As it melted, it created rivers that cut through stone, filled depressions that became lakes, and scattered boulders the size of houses across the landscape. When the ice finally withdrew, what remained was a transformed terrain. Rolling hills covered in fresh soil, natural harbors protected from ocean storms, rivers connecting inland territories to the sea. It was, geologically speaking, prime real estate. Nature just needed time to move in, and then, around 13,000 years ago, the first humans arrived. We don't know their names, we don't know their stories. What we know is that they came, following the animals they hunted, and they found a land rich with possibility. Archaeological evidence suggests these early inhabitants were nomadic, moving with the seasons, hunting large game animals that roamed the post-glacial forests. But something changed around 9,000 years ago. The archaeological record goes quiet. Sites that showed human activity suddenly contain nothing. It's possible that major climate shifts, or the extinction of many large animal species, made the region less habitable. Whatever the reason, people left. They came back around 3,000 years ago. This second wave of inhabitants brought more sophisticated tools, stone points, bows and arrows, evidence of semi-permanent settlements. By around 600 years ago, the region was home to the Lenape people, whose name roughly translates to original people or genuine people. The Lenape weren't primitive. They were skilled agriculturalists who understood the land intimately. They grew corn, beans, and squash, crops that complemented each other's growth patterns. They hunted deer and caught fish in rivers teeming with life. They built villages along waterways, understanding that water meant transportation, food, and life itself. The island the Lenape called Mannahatta wasn't the concrete jungle we know today. It was covered in forests, oak, hickory, chestnut trees rising toward the sky. Streams ran clear through valleys. Marshlands attracted birds by the thousands. The native population managed this landscape carefully, using controlled burns to clear underbrush and create better hunting grounds. By the time European ships appeared on the horizon, approximately 15,000 Lenape people lived in the region we now call New York. They had trade networks extending hundreds of miles. They had social structures, spiritual beliefs, artistic traditions. They had been here, by some estimates, for over 10,000 years. That world was about to change forever. Chapter 2. when worlds collided. The year was 1524. An Italian navigator named Giovanni da Verrazzano, sailing under the French flag, guided his ship into the protected waters of what would later be called New York Harbor. He was searching for a route to Asia. Instead, he found a natural harbor so perfect it would change the course of history. Verrazzano documented his encounter with the Lenape people in his journals. He described them as welcoming, noting their appearance and demeanor. But he didn't stay. His mission was exploration, not colonization. He sailed away, leaving the Lenape to their lives. That wouldn't last long. In 1609, nearly a century after Verrazzano's visit, an English navigator named Henry Hudson sailed into the same harbor. He was working for the Dutch East India Company, again searching for that elusive passage to Asia. Hudson sailed up the river that would eventually bear his name, trading with native peoples along the way, documenting everything he saw. The Dutch saw opportunity. The region offered something more valuable than a route to Asia. It offered furs, specifically beaver pelts. In Europe, beaver fur was luxury merchandise, used to make felt for fashionable hats. The demand was enormous, and the supply in Europe was running thin. In 1624, the Dutch West India Company established a permanent settlement. They called it New Amsterdam. 30 families arrived from the Netherlands, setting up a trading post at the southern tip of Manhattan Island. They built Fort Amsterdam for protection and started the business of trading European goods for Native American furs. The following year, 1625, the settlement officially became the capital of New Netherland, the Dutch territory that stretched from present-day Connecticut to Delaware. Now, here's where one of history's most enduring myths comes in. You've probably heard that Peter Minuit, the Dutch colonial director, purchased Manhattan Island from the Lenape for goods worth 60 guilders, often cited as equivalent to $24. The purchase happened in 1626, and yes, there was an exchange of goods for the island. But here's what that transaction really meant. The Lenape didn't have the same concept of land ownership that Europeans did. Land wasn't something you could own. It was something you used temporarily, seasonally. Selling Manhattan probably meant something different to them than it did to the Dutch, and the Lenape who made this deal may not have been the only group who considered Manhattan their territory. What's certain is that the Dutch believed they now owned the land, and they started building a settlement that would fundamentally reshape it. New Amsterdam grew slowly at first. By 1628, around 270 people lived in the settlement, including enslaved Africans brought by the Dutch West India Company to build infrastructure. These weren't just workers, they were the literal foundation builders of the city. Their forced labor constructed the fort, the homes, the streets. Their presence meant that New York's story includes slavery from its very beginning. The Dutch settlement was diverse almost immediately. German, French, and Flemish immigrants arrived alongside the Dutch. Jewish refugees found haven there. By 1643, it was reported that 18 languages could be heard in New Amsterdam, remarkable for a settlement of fewer than 1,000 people. But diversity didn't mean harmony. Relations with the Lenape deteriorated rapidly. Dutch settlers kept expanding into native territories. Cultural misunderstandings escalated into conflicts. In 1643, an incident in Lower Manhattan sparked what became known as Kieft's War, named after the Dutch director Willem Kieft, who ordered a brutal massacre of Lenape refugees. More than 120 Munsee people, part of the larger Lenape nation, were killed in what is now Lower Manhattan. The violence devastated both sides. Hundreds died. Settlements burned. The war only ended in 1645 with a fragile peace treaty. But the damage was done. Trust between the two peoples was shattered. New Amsterdam continued growing despite the turmoil. By 1653, the settlement received formal city status and established a municipal government modeled on Dutch cities. Around 1,500 people now called it home. The settlement was developing into a proper port city, trading not just furs, but also tobacco from the Chesapeake region and goods from the Caribbean. But the Dutch Golden Age in New Amsterdam wouldn't last. Across the Atlantic, another European power was watching with interest. England had territorial claims to the region dating back to earlier explorations, and by 1664, King Charles II decided it was time to act on them. In August 1664, 4 English warships sailed into New York Harbor. The Dutch Director General, Peter Stuyvesant, wanted to fight. But the leading merchants of New Amsterdam looked at the situation and made a practical decision. The English force was overwhelming. Resistance would mean destruction. Better to surrender and preserve what they'd built. On September 8, 1664, without firing a shot, New Amsterdam became New York, named after James, Duke of York, the king's brother. The Dutch period was over. Or was it? In 1673, during another Anglo-Dutch war, the Dutch briefly recaptured the city and renamed it New Orange. But the victory lasted less than a year. In 1674, the Treaty of Westminster returned the city permanently to English control. The English kept the Dutch architecture, the diverse population, and the commercial spirit. They added their own political structure, and most importantly, they kept the city's fundamental character as a place where people from everywhere could come to trade, work, and build new lives. New York was emerging from its chrysalis, transforming from a small trading post into something larger and more complex, but its most challenging transformation was still ahead. Chapter 3. The Revolutionary Crucible. By 1700, New York had grown into a bustling colonial city of around 5,000 people. It wasn't the largest city in the colonies. Boston and Philadelphia were bigger, but it was strategically positioned at the mouth of the Hudson River, controlling access to the interior. The 18th century brought steady growth and increasing importance. New York became a major port for the Atlantic trade. Sugar, tobacco, manufactured goods from Europe, and enslaved people from Africa. The city's economy hummed with activity. Shipbuilders worked the waterfront. Merchants grew wealthy. Taverns filled with sailors speaking a dozen languages. But beneath the prosperity, tensions were building between the colonies and their British rulers. New York City found itself torn. The merchant class depended on British trade and protection. Many were loyalists who saw no benefit in rebellion, but others, especially artisans and workers, felt the sting of British taxation and control. In 1765, representatives from 9 colonies met in New York City for the Stamp Act Congress. It was one of the first coordinated colonial responses to British policy. The message was clear: no taxation without representation. The British eventually repealed the Stamp Act, but the principle remained. The colonies were starting to think of themselves as something separate from Britain. As revolutionary fervor grew through the early 1770s, New York remained divided. When the Declaration of Independence was read publicly in New York on July 9, 1776, a mob of patriots toppled a statue of King George III at Bowling Green and sawed the royal crown finials off the surrounding iron fence. You can still see those saw marks today, but the celebration wouldn't last long. General George Washington understood New York's strategic importance. Control New York, control the Hudson River. Control the Hudson, divide the colonies in half. He brought his Continental Army to defend the city in the summer of 1776. On August 27, 1776, British forces under General William Howe invaded Long Island with over 32,000 troops, the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever assembled. Washington commanded roughly 10,000 soldiers, many poorly trained and poorly equipped. The Battle of Long Island was a disaster for the Americans. They were outmaneuvered and overwhelmed. Washington retreated to Brooklyn Heights, surrounded by British forces with his back to the East River. It looked like the end of the Continental Army, and possibly the end of the Revolution. Then Washington pulled off one of the most remarkable escapes in military history. Under cover of fog and darkness on the night of August 29th, he evacuated nearly 9,000 soldiers across the East River to Manhattan without losing a single life. The British woke up to find their prey had vanished. But Washington couldn't hold Manhattan either. On September the 15th, British troops landed at Kips Bay on the east side of Manhattan. The American troops panicked and fled. Washington himself rode among the retreating soldiers, trying desperately to rally them. It didn't work. The Americans abandoned New York City and retreated north. The British occupied New York for the next 7 years, the longest military occupation of any American city during the Revolutionary War. They turned it into their headquarters and primary base of operations. Loyalists from across the colonies flooded into the city, seeking British protection. At the same time, patriots fled to the surrounding countryside or joined Washington's army. The occupation was harsh. British troops commandeered homes. The city suffered 2 major fires. The first in September 1776 destroyed nearly a quarter of the city. Whether it was sabotage by retreating patriots or an accident remains debated, but the result was clear. Large portions of New York lay in ruins. Meanwhile, British prison ships anchored in New York Harbor became floating hells. Captured American soldiers were packed into rotting hulks like the HMS Jersey, given rotten food and brackish water. Disease ran rampant. More Americans died on these prison ships than in all the battles of the war combined. Estimates suggest over 11,000 prisoners perished in New York Harbor, their bodies often tossed overboard into the waters. The war dragged on. Washington won crucial victories at Trenton and Princeton. The French entered the war as American allies. And finally, in October 1781, General Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown. The war was effectively over, but New York remained in British hands until a peace treaty was signed. That didn't happen until September 1783. Then began the process of British withdrawal. It took months to organize the evacuation. British troops, loyalist families, and anyone else who feared retribution from the returning patriots. On November 22, 1783, General Washington and Governor George Clinton led the Continental Army into New York City. A soldier climbed the greased flagpole at Bowling Green, tore down the British flag, and raised the Stars and Stripes. The British occupation was over. New York immediately faced a crisis of identity. Thousands of loyalists had fled, taking wealth and expertise with them. The city's economy was in shambles. Buildings needed repair. Social wounds needed healing. But New York had something going for it, that perfect natural harbor and strategic location. It wouldn't take long for the city to prove it had a future even brighter than its past. Chapter 4. Building the Empire. The young United States needed a capital. From 1785 to 1790, that capital was New York City. On April 30th, 1789, George Washington took the oath of office as the first President of the United States on the balcony of Federal Hall on Wall Street. Thousands of New Yorkers packed the streets to witness history. Being the nation's capital gave New York prestige but little permanence. By 1790, political horse trading moved the capital to Philadelphia, and eventually to a new city being built on the Potomac River. New York would have to find another path to greatness. That path came in the form of a ditch, a very long, very ambitious ditch. In 1817, construction began on the Erie Canal, a project so audacious that Thomas Jefferson had called it little short of madness. The plan was to dig a canal stretching 363 miles from Albany to Buffalo, connecting the Hudson River to the Great Lakes. Nothing on that scale had ever been attempted in America. The project required unprecedented engineering. 83 locks to raise and lower boats through changes in elevation. Aqueducts to carry the canal over rivers. All of it dug and built mostly by hand. More than 9,000 workers labored on the canal, including many Irish immigrants who took the dangerous jobs American workers refused. On October 26, 1825, the Erie Canal officially opened. Governor DeWitt Clinton rode a canal boat from Buffalo to Albany, then down the Hudson to New York City. At a ceremony in New York Harbor, he poured water from Lake Erie into the Atlantic Ocean, symbolically wetting the waters of the west to the east. The canal changed everything. Before the Erie Canal, shipping goods from the Midwest to the East Coast took weeks and cost a fortune. Farmers in Ohio couldn't afford to send their wheat to New York markets. After the canal, the cost of shipping dropped to 1/10 of what it had been, and the time was cut in half. Suddenly, New York City became the primary gateway between the American interior and the Atlantic world. Grain, timber, and other goods flowed east through the canal to New York's port. Manufactured goods and European imports flowed west. The city's economy exploded. By 1850, New York handled more trade than Boston, Baltimore, and New Orleans combined. The population soared. In 1800, around 60,000 people lived in New York City. By 1850, that number had jumped to over 500,000. The city was growing too fast for its infrastructure to keep up. And the people arriving weren't just Americans moving from the countryside. They were coming from across the Atlantic. The 1840s brought the first great wave of European immigration. Ireland, devastated by the potato famine, sent hundreds of thousands of desperate refugees across the ocean. Many of them arrived in New York with nothing. No money, no connections, no English. They crowded into neighborhoods in lower Manhattan, living in conditions that were barely habitable. German immigrants arrived in large numbers too, fleeing political upheaval and economic hardship. Unlike the Irish, many Germans arrived with some capital and skills. They established businesses, bought property, and created communities. New York's population became remarkably diverse. By 1855, over half the city's residents were foreign-born. The city was no longer just American or even just European. It was becoming cosmopolitan in a way few cities in history had ever been, but diversity brought friction. Native-born Americans resented the immigrants, particularly the Catholic Irish. There were riots, discriminatory laws, and systematic prejudice. The Irish worked the hardest, most dangerous jobs: digging sewers, loading ships, building infrastructure. They were paid less than native-born workers and blamed for every social problem. Despite the prejudice, immigrants kept coming because New York offered something they couldn't find at home: opportunity. Not equal opportunity, not fair opportunity, but opportunity nonetheless. If you were willing to work yourself to exhaustion, you could survive. And if you were smart, skilled, and lucky, you might even thrive. The city's physical landscape was transforming as rapidly as its population. In 1811, city planners had laid out the commissioner's plan, creating the grid system that still defines Manhattan streets. The grid was practical, efficient, and utterly uninterested in natural topography. Hills were leveled, streams were buried. Nature was forced to conform to the plan. As the city spread northward, developers built tenements, multi-story apartment buildings designed to pack as many families as possible into the smallest space. These weren't the charming brownstones that tourists photograph today. These were dark, cramped buildings where entire families might live in a single room with no running water and limited ventilation. Yet people endured. They worked in factories that were springing up across the city. They sent their children to schools. They saved money when they could. They dreamed of better days ahead. And for the city itself, better days were coming. New York was about to enter its most transformative era yet, an age when it would become not just important, but iconic. Chapter 5. The Gilded Gateway. By 1880, New York City's population had reached over 1 million people. By 1900, it would be over 3 million. The city wasn't just growing. It was exploding into something the world had never quite seen before. The late 19th century brought another wave of immigrants, different from the Irish and Germans who had come before. These new arrivals came from Southern and Eastern Europe. Italians, Greeks, Russians, Poles, Eastern European Jews fleeing pogroms and persecution. They arrived at Castle Garden at the southern tip of Manhattan, which served as the nation's first federal immigration station from 1855 to 1890. But Castle Garden was overwhelmed. The flow of humanity was too great. Something bigger was needed. In 1892, the federal government opened a new immigration processing center on Ellis Island, a small piece of land in New York Harbor. Between 1892 and 1954, nearly 12 million immigrants would pass through its halls. That's roughly 40% of all Americans alive today who can trace their ancestry through Ellis Island. The process of entering America through Ellis Island became legendary. After arriving in New York Harbor, first- and second-class passengers barely faced inspection. If you could afford a good ticket, you were probably financially secure enough not to be a public charge. But steerage passengers, the poor traveling in the cheapest accommodations, had to go through Ellis Island. Doctors examined each person in seconds, looking for signs of disease or disability that might prevent them from working. Legal inspectors asked questions about their plans, their work skills, their family connections. Most people passed through in a few hours. Around 98% were admitted, but 2% weren't. They were sent back across the ocean, their American dream ending before it began. Ellis Island was nicknamed the Island of Hope and Tears. Hope for those who passed through. Tears for those who didn't. But immigrants didn't come to Ellis Island blind. They had heard about America from relatives who had made the journey earlier. They came with addresses scribbled on paper, names of people who might give them a place to sleep. They came with skills, tailoring, carpentry, stonework, and they came ready to work harder than they'd ever worked before. Many settled in ethnic neighborhoods in Manhattan. The Lower East Side became home to hundreds of thousands of Jews, creating the most densely populated place on earth. Little Italy, Chinatown, German neighborhoods, each group carved out space where they could speak their language, eat their food, and support each other in a strange new world. The tenement buildings in these neighborhoods were worse than anything you can probably imagine. Whole families crammed into rooms measuring roughly 10 feet by 10 feet. No bathrooms. Residents used communal outhouses in courtyards, or later shared toilets and hallways. No light in the interior rooms except what filtered through from the front. In summer, the buildings became ovens. In winter, they were barely warmer than the streets. Disease was rampant. Tuberculosis, cholera, typhoid, all flourished in the crowded, unsanitary conditions. Child mortality was staggering, but families persisted because this was still better than what they'd left behind, and because their children might have chances they never had, Meanwhile, a small percentage of New York's population was becoming spectacularly wealthy. The Gilded Age, a term coined by Mark Twain, saw the rise of industrial titans who controlled unprecedented amounts of wealth. J.P. Morgan in banking, John D. Rockefeller in oil, Cornelius Vanderbilt in railroads. These men's fortunes would be worth hundreds of billions in today's dollars. The contrast was stark. Fifth Avenue saw the construction of elaborate mansions for the rich, while a few blocks away, families lived in squalor. Some reformers fought to improve conditions. Jacob Riis, a journalist and photographer, documented tenement life in his groundbreaking work, How the Other Half Lives, shocking middle-class Americans with images of poverty they'd never seen. But the city was also creating public spaces that everyone could use. Central Park, completed in 1873 after years of construction, provided a green oasis in the midst of urban density. It wasn't natural. It was carefully designed and built, but it became a democratic space where rich and poor could walk the same paths. In 1883, the Brooklyn Bridge opened, connecting Manhattan to Brooklyn with what was then the world's longest suspension bridge. It was an engineering marvel, its Gothic towers rising nearly 300 feet above the East River. The bridge didn't just connect two places, it symbolized American ambition and engineering prowess. And in 1886, another symbol arrived. France gave the United States a gift, a 305-foot statue of a woman holding a torch, built on what had been called Bedloe's Island in New York Harbor. The Statue of Liberty wasn't originally conceived as a symbol of immigration. She represented Republican ideals and the friendship between two republics. But arriving immigrants saw her as they entered the harbor, and she became synonymous with American welcome. Emma Lazarus's poem, The New Colossus, added to the statue's pedestal in 1903, captured this new meaning. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Whether America fully lived up to those words is debatable, but the image was powerful and enduring. New York was becoming more than a city. It was becoming an idea, a place where anyone could reinvent themselves, where energy and ambition mattered more than birth or class. The reality was more complicated, more painful, and more unjust than the myth. But the myth itself had power. It drew people from around the world, and their arrival made the myth a little more real. The 19th century ended with New York poised on the brink of something extraordinary. The new century would see the city reach heights, literal and figurative, that would make it the most recognizable urban skyline on Earth. Chapter 6. Reaching for the Sky. On January 1st, 1898, New York City transformed overnight. Through a process called consolidation, the cities of New York and Brooklyn, along with most of Queens, Staten Island, and parts of the Bronx, merged into a single municipality. The 5 boroughs were born. New York City's population jumped to over 3 million, making it the second largest city in the world after London. But the early 20th century brought more than geographic expansion. It brought vertical ambition. Since the 1880s, architects had been experimenting with a new building type made possible by steel frame construction and passenger elevators, the skyscraper. Early examples like the Tower Building and the Flatiron Building showed what was possible. But New York was about to enter a golden age of skyscraper construction that would transform its skyline forever. The competition started modestly. In 1908, the Singer Building became the world's tallest at 612 feet. It held that title for less than a year before the Metropolitan Life Tower surpassed it at 700 feet. Then, in 1913, came the game changer, the Woolworth Building, rising 792 feet above Lower Manhattan. The Woolworth Building was different. It wasn't just tall, it was beautiful. Architect Cass Gilbert designed it in neo-Gothic style with terracotta facades that glowed golden in the sunlight. When it opened, it was called the Cathedral of Commerce. President Woodrow Wilson ceremonially lit the building from Washington by pressing a button that turned on all 80,000 light bulbs simultaneously. For 17 years, the Woolworth Building stood as the world's tallest. Then came the Roaring Twenties, and with them, skyscraper fever caught fire. The 1920s saw New York's economy boom. The stock market was soaring. Real estate speculation was rampant. Wealthy developers competed not just for profit, but for prestige. Having the tallest building in the world became the ultimate status symbol. In 1928, two architects, William Van Allen and H. Craig Severance, who had been former partners now, found themselves competitors. Each was designing a skyscraper, and each wanted his to be the tallest. Severance was working on 40 Wall Street for the Bank of Manhattan. Van Allen was designing the Chrysler Building for automobile magnate Walter Chrysler. The race was on. The Chrysler Building was designed to pay homage to the automobile age. The building featured decorative elements inspired by cars, hubcaps, radiator caps styled like hood ornaments, even gargoyles that looked like eagle hood ornaments from Chrysler vehicles. The setbacks were decorated with a chevron pattern, and the top was something special. Van Allen kept his final plan secret. While 40 Wall Street was announced to be 925 feet tall, the tallest in the world, Van Allen had been secretly constructing a 185-foot spire inside the Chrysler Building. In October 1929, the spire was lifted through the roof and assembled on top of the building, bringing its total height to 1,046 feet. The Chrysler Building had won. It was the world's tallest building. The victory celebration lasted less than a year. In 1930, even as the Great Depression was beginning to devastate the American economy, construction continued on an even taller building. The Empire State Building, designed by the architectural firm Shreve, Lamb and Harmon, was being built on the site of the old Waldorf Astoria Hotel at 34th Street and 5th Avenue. The Empire State Building's construction was a marvel of organization and speed. Work began in March 1930 and finished in April 1931, just over a year to build a 102-story building. At its peak, construction moved at a rate of 4.5 stories per week. Workers riveted together 57,000 tons of steel. The building's framework rose so quickly that it became a tourist attraction even during construction. On May 1, 1931, the Empire State Building officially opened. At 1,250 feet to the top of its lightning rod, it was the tallest building in the world. It would hold that title for nearly 4 decades, but the timing was tragic. The building opened in the depths of the Great Depression. Instead of tenants, it had empty office space. So much empty space that New Yorkers mockingly called it the Empty State Building. It took years before the building became profitable. The 1930s were difficult years for New York and America. The stock market crash of 1929 had triggered a worldwide economic catastrophe. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Unemployment reached 25%. Soup kitchens fed thousands who couldn't afford food. Shanty towns called Hoovervilles, after President Herbert Hoover, sprung up in parks and empty lots. Yet, even during the Depression, New York maintained its creative energy. The 1930s saw the construction of many Art Deco masterpieces. Not just the Chrysler and Empire State Buildings, but Rockefeller Center, the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and numerous other structures that still define New York's architectural character. Art Deco suited New York perfectly. Its emphasis on verticality, geometric patterns, and modern materials captured the city's forward-looking spirit. The style's decorative elements added beauty without excessive cost, making it practical even during economic hardship. Broadway theaters continued drawing crowds despite hard times. People needed entertainment, escapism. Movies, jazz music, and theatrical productions thrived because they offered temporary relief from daily struggles. And then, as the 1930s ended, a new crisis emerged that would make the Depression look almost manageable. War was coming to Europe, and America and New York would be drawn into a conflict that would reshape the world. Chapter 7: The War Years and Golden Age. Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941. America entered World War II, and New York City became a war machine. The city's factories, which had struggled during the Depression, suddenly ran around the clock producing military equipment. Shipyards built warships. Textile factories made uniforms. Food processors packaged rations. New York became one of the country's most important centers of war production. The harbor filled with military vessels. Troops shipped out through New York's piers, heading to battlefronts in Europe and the Pacific. The city saw blackout drills, rationing, and civil defense preparations. There was real fear that German submarines might attack the harbor or that the city might be bombed. But New York also became a refuge. European intellectuals, artists, and scientists fled the Nazi regime, and many settled in New York. This influx of talent would have lasting effects. The city became the center of abstract expressionism, as artists like Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning established New York as the art capital of the world, taking the title from Paris. When the war ended in 1945, New York celebrated with the rest of the nation. The famous photograph of a sailor kissing a nurse in Times Square captured the mood: relief, joy, hope for the future. The late 1940s and 1950s were New York's golden age. While much of Europe and Asia lay in ruins, New York was intact and economically dominant. By the late 1940s, the city had over 40,000 factories, employing 1 million workers. It was the world's largest manufacturing center, largest port, and financial capital. In 1947, construction began on the United Nations headquarters in Manhattan. Choosing New York as the UN's permanent home made the city not just nationally important, but internationally central. World leaders, diplomats, and delegates from every nation would gather in New York to debate the future of the world. The city's population peaked in 1950 at around 7.9 million people. Manhattan was dense with humanity, its neighborhoods vibrant with street life. Kids played stickball in the streets. Neighbors sat on stoops on summer evenings. Corner stores provided everything from groceries to gossip. But even during this golden age, cracks were showing. Robert Moses, the most powerful urban planner in New York's history, was reshaping the city according to his automobile-centric vision. He built highways, bridges, and parkways that connected New York to its growing suburbs. In the process, he destroyed established neighborhoods, displacing tens of thousands of residents. Moses's projects were controversial. He believed in urban renewal, tearing down old, blighted neighborhoods and replacing them with modern housing projects and highways. Sometimes this improved people's lives. Often, it destroyed communities that had existed for generations. The GEI Bill, passed in 1944, helped returning veterans buy homes. But most of those homes weren't in New York City. They were in the suburbs. Long Island communities like Levittown offered affordable single-family homes with yards, garages, and modern amenities. Young families, particularly white families, began moving out of the city. This was the beginning of white flight, the movement of white middle-class residents from cities to suburbs. The reasons were complex: desire for more space, fear of urban crime, pursuit of better schools, and often racial prejudice as black families began moving into previously all-white neighborhoods. As middle-class families left, they took their tax money with them. The city's tax base began shrinking just as its poorest residents needed more services. It was a vicious cycle that would accelerate in the coming decades. But for now, in the 1950s, New York still seemed invincible. It was the city of Broadway shows and jazz clubs, of Madison Square Garden and Yankee Stadium, of Wall Street and Madison Avenue. When people around the world imagined urban life, they imagined New York. Television shows, movies, and popular culture spread New York's image globally. The city became synonymous with American culture itself, for better and worse. The 1960s began with optimism, but they would end in crisis. Chapter 8: The Long Decline. The 1960s hit New York like a slow-moving storm. The problems came gradually but accumulated into a crisis that nearly destroyed the city. Manufacturing jobs began disappearing. Factories that had anchored neighborhoods for generations closed or moved to places where labor was cheaper and regulations were looser. Between 1969 and 1976, New York lost an average of 1,000 manufacturing firms per year. That's 500,000 jobs vanished. As jobs left, so did middle-class residents. Nearly 1 million people fled the city during the 1960s and 1970s. Buildings were abandoned as landlords couldn't collect enough rent to maintain them. Entire city blocks became wastelands of boarded-up buildings and empty lots. Crime soared. The murder rate, which had been around 400 per year in the 1950s, more than quadrupled by the 1970s. Car thefts, burglaries, muggings, all became commonplace. Subway crime became so notorious that many New Yorkers simply stopped using public transportation at night. The city became synonymous with urban decay. Times Square transformed from the crossroads of the world into a seedy strip of porn theaters, drug dealers, and prostitution. Public spaces felt dangerous. Parks were avoided after dark. In 1965, a massive power blackout hit New York and much of the Northeast. The city went dark, and while that first blackout was relatively peaceful, it foreshadowed worse to come. The 1970s brought New York to its knees. The city government, struggling with declining tax revenue and rising costs, tried to keep up by borrowing money. By 1975, the city had accumulated over $11 billion in debt and couldn't pay it back. Banks refused to loan more money. The city couldn't meet its payroll. Public services were cut to the bone. Police forces, sanitation workers, firefighters, all faced massive layoffs. Schools eliminated programs. Parks went unmaintained. The city was going bankrupt. In October 1975, President Gerald Ford initially refused to provide federal aid to help New York. The famous New York Daily News headline captured the moment: "Ford to city, drop dead." Eventually, federal loans were provided, but with strict conditions. The city had to slash spending, freeze wages, and accept oversight from an emergency financial control board. The cuts were devastating. Thousands of city workers lost their jobs. The City University of New York, which had been free since its founding, started charging tuition. Public services deteriorated further. It felt like the city was eating itself to survive. Then came July 13th, 1977. A lightning strike on a power line triggered a cascading failure of the electrical grid. At 9:34 p.m., New York City went dark. This blackout was different from 1965. This time, the city exploded. Looting broke out across multiple neighborhoods. Stores were ransacked, buildings burned. Over 3,000 people were arrested. The damage totaled hundreds of millions of dollars. The blackout wasn't just about opportunistic crime. It was an eruption of frustration, anger, and desperation from communities that felt abandoned by the city and the country. Neighborhoods that had seen jobs disappear, services cut, and opportunities vanish responded with fury. The morning after, New York looked like a war zone. Shattered storefronts, burned buildings, debris-filled streets. The images went around the world. New York, once the symbol of American vitality, had become the symbol of American urban crisis. Many people wrote New York off as finished. The conventional wisdom was that big cities were obsolete, that the future belonged to suburbs and Sunbelt cities. New York seemed like a cautionary tale, a city that had reached too high and fallen too hard. But New York has never been good at accepting defeat. In 1978, Ed Koch became mayor. He was a fiscal conservative who understood that before the city could dream again, it had to balance its budget. The work was unglamorous. Renegotiating contracts, restructuring debt, rebuilding relationships with banks. But it was necessary, and slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, things began to stabilize. Crime rates, while still high, stopped increasing. The budget moved toward balance. The city started making plans instead of just reacting to crises. The 1980s saw the beginning of New York's long comeback. Wall Street, which had been struggling, suddenly boomed. Financial services became the city's dominant industry. The stock market tripled between 1982 and 1990. Money poured into Manhattan. The influx of wealth was double-edged. It brought investment and jobs, but it also accelerated inequality. Manhattan neighborhoods began gentrifying. Old working-class communities transformed into expensive areas that long-time residents couldn't afford. The city was recovering, but not everyone was recovering together. In 1989, David Dinkins became New York's first black mayor, representing a changing demographic reality. But he inherited enormous challenges. Crime was still devastating communities. Relations between police and minority communities were terrible. In 1993, Rudolph Giuliani defeated Dinkins and brought a new approach to crime. Under Police Commissioner William Bratton, the NYPD implemented broken windows policing, aggressively pursuing minor offenses on the theory that disorder breeds more disorder. They also used a new system called CompStat that tracked crime patterns and held local commanders accountable for their precincts. Crime plummeted. Between 1993 and 2001, the murder rate fell by 67%. Other major crimes dropped similarly. The transformation was dramatic and in some ways miraculous. Neighborhoods that had been no-go zones became safe to walk through. Times Square was cleaned up, the porn theaters replaced by family-friendly businesses. But the strategies were controversial. Aggressive policing disproportionately affected minority communities. Stop-and-frisk tactics led to thousands of young Black and Latino men being stopped by police without probable cause. The city was safer, but at what cost to civil liberties and community trust? Still, by the end of the 1990s, New York had achieved something many thought impossible. It had come back. The city was thriving again, its population growing, its economy strong, its cultural institutions flourishing. As the calendar turned to the year 2000, New York seemed poised for another golden age. The dot-com boom was creating new wealth. Real estate values were soaring. The city felt unstoppable. And then, on a bright Tuesday morning in September, everything changed. Chapter 9. Trial and Resilience. September 11, 2001. 8:46 a.m. American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center. 17 minutes later, United Airlines Flight 175 hit the South Tower. By 10:28 a.m., both towers had collapsed. 2,977 people died that day. 343 firefighters and 60 police officers were killed trying to save others. The towers, once symbols of New York's economic might, became graves for thousands. The attacks weren't just strikes against buildings. They were attacks on the idea of New York, the cosmopolitan city that represented openness, diversity, and connection to the world. Terrorists chose the World Trade Center precisely because of what it symbolized. Lower Manhattan became a war zone. Massive clouds of dust covered streets for blocks. Fires burned for weeks. The smell, a mixture of burning metal, concrete, and worse, permeated the air for months. But New York's response was remarkable. Emergency workers from around the country rushed to help. Volunteers showed up in the thousands, offering whatever assistance they could. Blood banks were overwhelmed with donations. The city came together in ways that surprised even longtime New Yorkers. The economic impact was severe. The attacks destroyed or damaged over 24 buildings. Hundreds of businesses were displaced. Tourism plummeted. The city lost an estimated $19 billion just in direct damages, not counting the broader economic fallout. But rather than accept defeat, New York rebuilt. The process was slow and contentious. Debates raged about what should replace the towers. Some wanted a memorial. Others wanted office space to show that terrorism couldn't win. Eventually, planners designed a compromise, a new complex with One World Trade Center as its centerpiece, rising 1,776 feet, along with a memorial on the footprints of the original towers. One World Trade Center, completed in 2014, became the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere. Its height, 1,776 feet, was chosen deliberately to reference the year of American independence. The building was a statement. New York would not be intimidated. While the city was still recovering from 9/11, another crisis struck in October 2012. Hurricane Sandy, a massive post-tropical cyclone, slammed into the New York area. Storm surge flooded the subway system, tunnels, and coastal communities. Over 40 people in the city died. Damage estimates reached $19 billion. The storm exposed how vulnerable New York was to climate change. Sea levels were rising. Storms were intensifying. The city that had been built on the assumption of stable sea levels now faced an existential threat. The response has been ongoing. The city launched resilience programs to harden infrastructure, elevate buildings in flood zones, and prepare for future storms. It's expensive, time-consuming work, and it's far from complete. Despite these challenges, the 21st century has seen continued growth. The city's population has surged past 8.3 million, the highest in its history. New York has remained a magnet for talent, ambition, and capital from around the world. But the city faces persistent problems. Housing costs have skyrocketed, making it nearly impossible for working-class and even middle-class families to afford to live in many neighborhoods. Income inequality is stark. New York is simultaneously home to enormous wealth and persistent poverty. The subway system, once the envy of the world, desperately needs modernization. Infrastructure built a century ago is struggling to serve a 21st century city. Delays, breakdowns, and frustration have become part of the daily commute for millions. Climate change poses an ongoing threat. The next Sandy-level storm isn't a question of if, but when. The city must continue investing billions in flood barriers, elevated subway entrances, and resilient construction. And yet, New York endures. It adapts. It changes. The city that exists today would be unrecognizable to someone from 1900, just as the city of 1900 would be unrecognizable to someone from 1800. But certain elements remain constant. New York is still the place where people from everywhere come to make their mark. It's still the city where you can hear 100 languages on a single street corner. It's still the place where a bodega owner from Bangladesh serves a customer from Brazil who's talking on the phone in Portuguese while ordering a bacon, egg, and cheese. The skyline continues to evolve. New towers rise, pushing ever higher. Neighborhoods transform, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse, often for both simultaneously. The city's essential character, though, persists through all the changes, from glaciers to skyscrapers, from 13,000 people to 8 million, from Lenapehoking to New Amsterdam to New York. The story of this city spans thousands of years, but it's not finished. New York has survived and thrived through colonial wars, revolutionary struggles, economic crashes, urban decay, terrorist attacks, and natural disasters. Each crisis could have been the end. Each time, people predicted the city's death. And each time, New York proved them wrong. What makes New York remarkable isn't just its size or wealth or cultural influence, though it has all of those. What makes it remarkable is its fundamental character as a place of constant transformation and reinvention. No other major city has so thoroughly remade itself so many times. The glaciers carved the harbor. The Lenape shaped the landscape. The Dutch established trade. The British built institutions. Immigrants from every corner of the globe added their cultures, languages, and dreams. Every wave of newcomers changed the city, and the city changed them in return. Today's New York faces challenges that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations. Climate change threatens to flood the streets where millions commute daily. Housing costs force families to leave the city their grandparents built. Technology is reshaping work in ways that could hollow out industries that employ hundreds of thousands. But if history teaches anything, it's that New York adapts. The city that survived British occupation, yellow fever epidemics, the draft riots, the 1970s fiscal crisis, and 9/11 will find ways to confront whatever comes next. It may not be easy, it may not be pretty, but it will happen because that's what New York does. The bridges, tunnels, and subways built by earlier generations still carry millions of people every day. The parks and cultural institutions they created still enrich lives. The spirit of ambition and resilience they embodied still defines the city. New York isn't perfect. It never has been. It's too expensive, too crowded, too loud, too everything. But it's also the place where someone with nothing can become something, where ideas turn into movements, where culture is created and debated and exported to the world. So here's to the city that was a glacier, a forest, a village, a colony, a battlefield, a port, an industrial powerhouse, and a global capital. Here's to the city that was burned, bombed, flooded, and bankrupted, but never beaten. Here's to New York, the city that never sleeps, and apparently never stops reinventing itself. Like this video and subscribe to American Tales for more interesting stories about American history.